Have you read so there's this really, I don't, some people get like he goes too far for some people, but there's this really, really brilliant guy who like everybody should read one way or another. Pepe Escobar, he writes for Asia Times.
Mm-mm.
He's got a new column on the French and the
Oh,
Keyboard. It's very in your lane, Liz. I'd look it up.
really? Okay. Interesting.
It is interesting. He's also totally like on the he's very interested in like the Chinese narrative of where this came from. But I want to read you
Mm.
a little bit of a quote because like I think that the way you talk about conspiracy theories or whatever we're calling them now is significant because like a lot of us I think kind of grew up sort of coming of age politically and realizing like actually like there's a lot of bullshit in conspiracy culture. It can take us down like really bad paths, like you're talking about something real and then all of a sudden like you're in some type of like anti-Semitic theory. And there also can be like super disempowering because if you think like the whole world is just like mapped out and preordained and like there's no human agency. And but now I feel like we've gotten, especially in like liberal discourse, and what's fun about your show is like people have gotten like, oh well, that's a conspiracy. And it's like, right, there's conspiracy thinking like Alex Jones, and then it's like, are we actually saying that conspiracies don't exist? Because like human beings are conspiring like every second, like every institutional level. And I'm going to read you really quickly. I'm going to truncate this quote from this guy, Danny Roddy, which I think is kind of interesting. He's like, similarly, skeptics that doubt the official narrative behind widely televised tragedy might find motivation in the fact that his government is constantly lying to him. Instead of victim blaming people for quote unquote wrong ideas, it might be more productive to build new systems to reduce imposed systems that tend to make everyone sick while stifling human potential. And of course, I'd call that imposed system capitalism. But what do you think about that kind of like framework around conspiracy theories? Do you buy it?
Um, yeah, I think a friend of mine said once that once something is called a conspiracy theory, it loses its value,
Mm-hmm.
maybe. And it's like once it's sort of like slotted into like what you're talking about, how we think about these things, like, you say Alex Jones or just like general quackery, or that there is a kind of like, you know, uh, demobilizing quality to it, where it feels like suddenly everything's out of your hands because everything is being controlled, like what you're talking about. And so once you kind of like, he was saying that like once it's sort of like rhetorically in that mode, it has lost its political content. And I wonder if there's like maybe this is what we're doing with the podcast. I don't know. I don't even know what we're doing with the podcast now anymore. We're figuring it out still. But maybe it's a way to like rescue some of these things from that dustbin where people put things and say like, hey, wait a second, like actually there is political content here that we need to struggle with, and there is something important to map out here. Not like like you say, like you don't have to put a tinfoil hat on to understand the way that power moves through the various state and capital institutions. I mean, and you can't, because you do have to understand that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. So like what like I feel like a concrete example of that I've been thinking a lot about is just like our role, even like what you and I do on computers, using these platforms that are owned by a handful of companies that have, the best surveillance system to human history that we not only tracks us, like we happily participate in. Like we use the phone that like tracks our temperature to see what we might be doing while we're holding the thing, right? And then like
Mm.
how to like consent. So like that to me is a really interesting discourse, especially right now, because it's like, okay, so we're all quarantined. or a lot of, I mean, if you're privileged enough to be quarantined, like if you're in a certain part of the economic ladder or of, in medicine, you're not. But if you have the ability to be quarantined and actually like still do your work, we're using these communication technologies and platforms and all the time anyways, but now it's like even more reinforced because we can't even say like we were talking recently about how like, when people would be like trash on Twitter or something, and then like and if they got criticized for being an asshole, they'd be like, oh, it's just online, like whatever. Now it's like, well, this is like where we are. What's a good way to think about like our relationship with having these conversations on platforms, getting these ideas put forward on platforms that are like, and I like this a lot about your show. It's like, these platforms are not neutral and they are fundamentally not on our terrain. So it's not even a question of just like, oh, well, I'm going to use that well. Sure, use that well. Let's go for it. That's awesome. We should. But the context in which we're on these things goes to really concentrated capital and surveillance and intelligence systems. And we need to like grapple with that.
Yeah, but at the same time, like everything we do does.
Yeah.
And I think that I guess this is like a lot of stuff that I think there's this like idea that we can just build our own. I mean, I don't know. This gets into probably some of the problems that I have with anarchism, right? Which is like this idea that we can just like build state organs that can because that's at this point, that's what we're talking about. Because you're talking about basically a media apparatus, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really have, I guess you can do like some of that on the internet, but even the internet is its own institution that's completely embedded with these same sort of compromised state, capital, techno, surveillance, etc. Institutions that you're grappling with. So at a certain point, I think, we did a really long interview with Yasha Levine.
Yep.
And we were talking about, and he's great. And
it's a good book.
Yeah, he has a very different take on a lot of the surveillance stuff than I think a lot of traditional Americans, because I think whether we know it or not, there is a very like libertarian bent like embedded in the American soul, like even as much as you resist it, which is quite different from, obviously Yasha's Russian. And there's this sort of sense of like, well, if the government can see and surveil and do everything, then that's the number one priority. We have to get rid of that first. Otherwise we can't do anything. And it's like, well, at some point it almost becomes an excuse for you to not to do anything. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I almost wonder if it's like, don't get me wrong. I'm not excusing, at this point in my mind, the way that I conceive of like the surveillance state is so vast, but also it's so bureaucratized, and the stuff that they're not combing through everything. They're just sweeping everything up. And at this point, what they're doing with it is to sell, skinny tea on Instagram. Like it's not even, do you know what I mean? It's almost totally pathetic. It's so pathetically American that we would use these like sort of like horrific dystopian sci-fi surveillance powers to sell like Casper mattress. It's like, Americans, we're so small-minded, even in our, anyway. But
even in our evil.
Yeah, totally. We aren't, but you know what I'm saying.
I do.
I don't know. I wonder.
So do you think that's interesting? Because then that's like another challenge right now of like, actually, this also goes back to internet discourse, because especially, now like there isn't like the same utopian story that gets told around the internet.
Yeah, that has totally broken down.
That's really broken down. But the early utopian stories of the internet was all along like, the kind of traditional libertarian, but definitely also anarchist lens. And like, I agree. Like, I agree with you about a lot of the critiques of anarchism. And I think that a lot of it can be kind of fantasy based and myopic. And then at the same time, it's like, especially now, it's like, is this there's no understanding or strategy for state power there. But then there's also like, right, but what the fuck is it? Like there isn't there at the same time, at least there's like the advantage of having some frameworks like mutual aid or whatever, which maybe are like accessible in a certain way now versus like, oh no, what we need is like a vanguard party, right? I'm like, oh, okay. Like that becomes like its next fantasy life. I think maybe that's what it is. It's like, how does forget about like trying to be pure or not work with things as they are, because that's impossible and it's not useful to think that way. But at the same time, like, what is a way that thinks about like how to take this stuff on that isn't like magical thinking, basically?
I mean, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it has to do like, I mean, I think that this moment that we're in, and like we're at what's basically, the tail end of what felt like possibly a little moment with Corbyn and Bernie, right?
Yep.
And that's gone.
Yeah.
And now we've got this once in a century, once in a generation fucking pandemic, which everything is up in the air now in terms of, I mean, that's what we keep saying on the podcast. It's like history is back in motion, which is, exciting, but equally terrifying, and I think it's going to, I mean, I think, it's tough because I think that in the United States, we don't really know how things are going to shake out. And that is going to determine what left politics is going to look like, as we move forward through the next decade or so. And I don't really know. Like, and I'm saying that because it's like, when you look at the scope of this crisis that we're in, like, I don't even think anyone's really even talking about it enough as a crisis. Like, this is a fucking crisis.
Yeah.
Like we're looking at like 30-40% unemployment. This is unprecedented in fucking history. Like, so, that's what I mean by when I'm saying we don't know how things are going to shake out. What I do think is what we're seeing, and I think this is true historically, but people always forget, is that workers are always ahead of organizers, right? And so you're seeing workers already who, essential workers. It's so funny that they're essential, but of course that means, they're paid pennies, walking out, making demands, calling for more strikes and more mobilizations. You're seeing it at Amazon, and these are important places to attack right now. And that's very exciting for, these people. And I think I don't know, I was thinking about this, and it's not good in a situation where it's like, these people are risking, workers are risking their lives also to demand better. And I think we've forgotten that it takes that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we've forgotten that, like, yeah, it takes risking your life, and that's really fucking scary. And I don't know, things just feel to me to be shifting, very quickly and out of a kind of, back into like a very real place, a real political place.
There's this
I don't know.
No, there's this book I read a couple of months ago by Bruno Latour, and it's a cool book, but the title is like what stuck with me most. It was just called Down to Earth. And it was literally the idea of like the eco crisis. In this case, he was talking the book is focused on that, but it could apply to this, is like, we're in a collective fantasy life. Like limitless growth is a fantasy. And we are going to start getting shocks to the system in terms of like real physical things that will literally take us back down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I really think that's going to happen. Like, I mean, look, I was at the grocery store the other day. They don't have any eggs.
Right.
There's no eggs in my neighborhood. So that's just what it is. And that's a small thing. That's not a big deal, whatever. But what I mean is we're going to see massive supply chain shocks. We're going to see, I'm sorry to say this because you're in New York, but it's like, I don't know what the situation in New York is going to be like in a month, let alone 6, And there's other places in the country that are going to face similar situations, unfortunately. So it's like almost like, yeah, I don't know. I think there's like, I think people really need to stay vigilant about all the shifts that are happening, and get themselves in kind of a mindset of like, okay, like things are not going back to any kind of normal in the way that we previously thought things would just kind of continue on in some way. It's
What is
just like,
that mindset to you? Like what, because like intellectually it's like I could see like the coping mechanism of like, all right, like it's going to be a couple of weeks and then all right, it's going to be a couple of months and then right, like I get that, but there's also like we talk about like the mindsets or what is sort of emotionally required even now, and I don't know like what does that actually look like or how to cultivate that, like because I also think that people will, particularly when you're under pressure, mostly you go back to like your comfort zones to the
yeah.
extent that that's like humanly possible right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, I don't know. I think it's like, I mean, I struggle with it. It's not like I don't have the answers. Like, there are some days where I'm like having a really hard time. I don't know. It's yeah, I don't know. I don't have any good answers. I think it's just like really like, I think one of the hardest tasks is and this is kind of what you were talking about using all these platforms and these kind of screens that are now mediating, is that it's like, it's no secret that we're increasingly alienated from one another over and that was sort of like growing exponentially over the past 8-9 years, ever since basically the big tech revolution, 10 years, whatever. But now that stuff is like, it was invisible before, and now it's very visible and present, and you're like, oh no, we really are. It's like we're seeing physical manifestation of like what was already kind of always present but hidden from our out of plain view, whatever.
Yeah.
It's like Brace said the other day, and I think it's totally true. It's like everyone's an incel now. It's like the great incelification. And there's something to that where we have to like dig into ourselves and become really creative about how we're going to connect with other people. And if we don't, we're not going to make it through. And now we have to do it in like these new and novel ways using technology that most of us fucking hate.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's kind of like a weird, it's a weird headspace to get into. I don't begrudge people for like having a hard time with it.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, that also, I mean, my kick now, and another thing like that people on the left sometimes really don't like, is like there has to be a spiritual component to this. Now, like how people define that and what that means to them, and I don't even care. And I get all of the critiques of fundamentalism and new ageism and whatever, but there is something in certain like practices or ideas that do actually correlate with, you need to like expand the connective tissue of your empathy. You need to like maybe also have like a better relationship with your own physiology as we get more virtual. And that like there are ways of cultivating that, which and because it seems to me like that is going to be part of that digging that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think it's like, it takes a lot of discipline to
Right.
manage this. And that's something that I think as Americans, and particularly, as everyone likes to say about millennials, a lot of people lack especially young people lack self-discipline. And like, that's not really, it's not really part of our culture in a way that I think it is in other places. And cultivating that on one's own is, it takes a lot of work. It's important though. And it's also important, I think, for left politics. I mean, I would love to see a lot more discipline on the left. So perhaps it could be useful in that way, moving forward. But I think that, and that means creating a routine and connecting with people and it all kind of goes into it. Otherwise, you're going to go insane, and you're just not going to be useful for other people, and they're not going to be useful for you. Like, you know what I mean? It's all these two-way streets that you have to figure out.
Yeah, but I think that that's really brilliant right there too. Like in especially in a US context, we have this allergy because like the rhetoric of self-responsibility has been used by, basically neoliberal and capitalist discourses to punish the poor and discipline people and all of this. We know all of that, right? But then at the same time, like there is literally a reality that like interdependence is a two-way street, and what you bring into a group as an individual matters, and then what the group feeds back to individuals matter. Like it's a dynamic reciprocal process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just like even actually having the capacity to say we need to talk about something like self-discipline, not in the way that we've already rejected and we've already talked about, and that's totally fine. We can have that critique, but that we can't just be triggered by that terminology. And we also have to see the objective and extraordinary like truth of that. Like discipline matters, self matters. That's the strength of your own like organism you're going to bring to a collective effort.
Right. Well, you and I have always talked, I've talked previously about, that, dissenting discourse, or it's not, I'm hoping that a lot of that stuff breaks down during all of this, which I feel like I was talking to some other people about that. And I think that like left spaces, however we want to call that, I hate that word space.
I don't like the word space, and I want to take a break from bodies.
No, but I think, and yeah, we've talked about this, that it's been increasingly up until now, it feels very difficult for dissenting opinions to not even just like take flight, but like be allowed.
Right.
And everyone, we know Vampire's Castle, whatever, we don't have to say that stuff again, but it's, if it really does feel like all of this stuff is laying bare how meaningless a lot of those, like how trivial a lot of the like, inter-left petty fighting has been. It's like none of this stuff matters. I don't know.
No, 100%. 100. I mean, it doesn't matter. And then it's like even beyond that, like what are we? I mean, I've said that in terms of it not mattering, in terms of thinking about like what is actually appealing to a broad set of people, all of that still stands. And then there's also like the immediacy right now of like, what are we being called to do by circumstances? And I think that does take like a very different and really challenging level of introspection, for sure. And discipline too, because I mean, it's like even it's discipline even in like a small way to not be like personally reckless right now, right? Like I don't want to deal with this, what the fuck, I'm gonna go take a run. Like you can take a run, but you know my point. Like I don't want to deal with this shit.
I know, I saw photos of New Yorkers, they were all like lining up on the West Side Highway to look at the fucking ship. It's like, bro, what are you doing? What is everyone doing? Get inside, man.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.